Welcome back. Good to have you here. I know you've been networking for the last hour, which is wonderful. Some of you managed to get to a couple of the sessions, all terrific. But now we've got what I would call really an exceptional hour set aside for really a wonderful discussion between Diane Francis, who many of you know from her work with the National Post, of course, and many other things that occupies Diane, and of course, Premier Wynne. So it promises to be a very interesting session. And by the way, there'll be opportunities again for you to use the app and pose questions. And the Premier has said there's no question that is too difficult for her. So she's prepared to answer all of them. Or, if need be, I'm happy to step up and take it on. So I'm really delighted that Aon is sponsoring this session. So first order of business is to invite Kent Peters up. Kent is the National Director of Performance Security with Aon, and he will introduce Diane. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Aon is pleased to sponsor this session entitled Moving Ontario Forward, featuring Diane Francis and the Honourable Kathleen Wynne, Premier of Ontario. Diane Francis is a well-known journalist, author of 10 books, and editor-in-large at the National Post. She is adjunct faculty at Singularity University in Mountain View, Washington, California, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., a distinguished professor at Ryerson University, and also on the boards of the Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative and the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. She writes for newspapers and magazines around the world and is a sought-after speaker at conferences and on broadcasts. Her popular Twitter feed on tech and corruption now has more than 680,000 followers around the world. The Honourable Kathleen Wynne is Ontario's 25th Premier. Since taking office in 2013, Premier Wynne's accomplishments include balancing the provincial budget for the first time in a decade, making record-breaking infrastructure investments in Ontario roads, schools, hospitals, and transit systems, and securing a historic national deal to improve retirement security by enhancing the Canada Pension Plan. Premier Wynne was first elected as the Member of Provincial Parliament for Don Valley West in 2003 and has served as Minister for 5 departments and been re-elected 3 times. Before becoming an MPP, Premier Wynne served as a trustee on the Toronto District School Board. Ladies and gentlemen, please provide a warm welcome to Diane Francis and Premier Wynne.
Well, we're twins.
We are.
How about that?
We got the memo.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a number of questions about a lot of things for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have the floor open to questions from the audience. And I'm sure those would be better than my questions, but anyway. Okay, so we are missing the governor of Oklahoma, who was supposed to be here, and I know you know her quite well. And for whatever reason, she couldn't come. But would you please tell us what common ground you've found, for instance, with that governor, and then I'll talk to you about other people you've met in the United States. But I'm kind of intrigued by that.
Yeah, Governor Fallon and I had the opportunity to talk when I attended the National Governors Association meeting in Rhode Island, and we talked about a lot of things. We talked about education, but we talked about infrastructure and the need for infrastructure. And she I know wanted to be here at this conference because she was asking about how our AFP works, how our P3 procurement process actually works here. Because one of the common themes that has run through my meetings with governors when we haven't been talking about NAFTA, which I know we will talk about in a minute, but has been the difficulty in getting stuff built. And wanting to know how we've managed to develop a procurement process and a financing process that actually allows projects to get built on time, on budget. And Monique Smith, who is our representative in Washington, has spent a fair bit of time traveling around the States, and Mark's nodding because he knows that she's really been an advocate for the process that we've put in place here. So I know that Mary Fallon wanted to be here to have that conversation with us.
It's troublesome to do P3s and infrastructure in the U.S. for a whole bunch of reasons, not just protectionist. It seems to me that they have trouble getting their financing act together.
Yeah, and one of the problems is for them, as I understand it, and I don't know the technicalities, but I think one of the challenges is getting long-term appropriations, long-term financing. So they can't plan in the way that we can, because they can't be guaranteed the appropriations through their government.
Cycle.
One election, it's like 4 years. Yeah, that is
can't amortize anything on that,
and you can't plan, and that's the thing. That is the defining feature of infrastructure. And when I was Minister of Transportation in 2010, it became so clear to me what happens when you stop building infrastructure in a jurisdiction. That you lose the expertise, you lose the ability to stay on top of maintenance, and so you actually incur more cost because you haven't had that ongoing incremental building. So it's a real challenge for the United States, and I think that we have a lot to contribute to the conversation. I have also said in many conversations, including with Governor Fallon, that when we began down this road, when we came into office under the previous Premier in 2003, we had to overcome political perceptions, and we had to make the argument that you could build public infrastructure in partnership with the private sector and still serve the public good and still maintain public ownership, but have a system that actually provided enough of a return to the private sector that they would take the risk. That government can't take that much risk. You can't catch up on the infrastructure that needs to be built in this province without having a partner. So that's been our experience, and I think I think the proof is in the pudding. We've had pretty great success.
So broadening your perspective drawn from the Americans, you've done quite a tour of the U.S., visiting other governors and I guess legislators and senators and congresspeople.
I've met.
And I just wondered what some of your principal takeaways are. And I know it's not just infrastructure; it's also related to trade and general relationships. But
it is. So I've met or talked to 32 governors now. I know, it's a lot.
Trump hasn't met that many, and never will.
Yeah, well, no comment on that. So, some of them we've met on the phone. Some of them I've met many times. The governor of Michigan and I have spent a lot of time together. I was just down co-hosting the Great Lakes Governors meeting with Governor Snyder, and we had the opportunity to talk about trade, but procurement's part of that, and the ability to work across the border is part of that. So my takeaway from these conversations with these governors, and most of them are Republican. Most of the governors are Republican. 28 states. For 28 states, Ontario is the number one or number two export market. 20 were their number one market. 8 were their number two market. So the conversation I've been having with the governors is, do you think the people who you serve understand how integrated we are? Do you think, is there more that we can do to impress upon folks that, yes, we are dependent on the United States for the market. We absolutely are. But the United States is likewise dependent on Canada. It's a very, very symbiotic relationship. So the interesting thing for me is that with virtually all of those governors and with the congresspeople and senators that I've met, they all get that. They all get how integrated we are. And as we began the discussions around NAFTA, we all were going in with this should be a do no harm conversation. It shouldn't be about how to blow up this trade deal. It should be about what was missing. 23 years ago, what wasn't in the agreement. We didn't have e-commerce. We didn't have digital. So let's make sure those things are there. Let's talk about cybersecurity, but let's not blow up an agreement that has really served both jurisdictions very well. We also talk about Buy America, and when we talk about Buy America, very quickly the discussions around procurement come up. And when I note that we're investing in Ontario $190 billion over 13 years, we're in year 4 of that investment, those are a lot of projects that are available for bidding. And so I don't think there's anybody who understands the relationship that wants to shut down that possibility. But the problem is that there's a disconnect between those conversations and what's coming out of the White House. And that is the consistent message that we've received. And as we've seen the negotiations go on over the last few months, we've seen that disconnect grow, I'm afraid. And so I still believe that there are good, rational discussions happening at the table. I think that we can get there, but I think it's very uncertain. I think it's a very uncertain process and time.
Yeah, they don't have a confederation that's devolved like we do. They do have a unitary federal system, and it's really powerful. But next question is, and I know you're a participant in it, but I always think that what we're seeing now with transparency and tech and so on is a bottom-up, a grassroots. In other words, I think that policies and politics has to start from the bottom up, and they have to listen instead of top down. To the question is, it seems to me that more and more attention is and should be paid on the regional cross-border subnational organizations, the Great Lakes Group and Cascadia, they call it, in Western Canada with the States. I think that's very important for progress going forward. Do you want to comment on where that movement is going?
Well, I think it's at the subnational, so the state, territorial, provincial level, that so much has gotten done. I mean, if we talk about infrastructure, the Infrastructure Ontario model has really been looked at all over the world, not just in the United States. And so we developed that here out of a need to address an infrastructure deficit, because we had not, and this is not a partisan comment, we'd seen government after government not make investments, and we needed to find a way to start to catch up. But it's not just in that area. If you look at climate change and adaptation and GHG reduction, it's been at the subnational level that progress is being made. So I think that will continue. The importance of subnational, and I would say right now in the United States, it is at the state level where these voices and these policies and the initiatives are going to have to take place, because there's nothing coming out of the White House that's allowing the states to move forward. They have to bring it from their communities up. And municipalities have a big role to play in that. I think that sometimes when we talk about government, we forget that at the municipal level is where the rubber really hits the road, literally. So when I talk about implementing our infrastructure plan, that is hand in hand, that we're going hand in hand with our municipal partners. And when I was Minister of Transportation, we were working at that point to get asset management plans in place, so we would know what the needs were across the province. We've done that, and that is a huge benefit to the conversation now that we're having with the federal government, because we actually know what's needed.
Interesting. NAFTA.
The
talks are going to resume again later in the month.
Yeah.
And they're going to drag on and on. But what is Ontario's priorities, and then we'll get into the issue of Buy American reciprocity.
Yeah. I mean, our number one priority is to protect and stand up for, I won't use the word protect, I was using that in the non-technical sense, but to stand up for Ontario's workers and our businesses, to make sure that we continue to be able to thrive and grow business here, which we have been doing. I mean, Ontario's leading economic growth in the country. We're outstripping the G7 countries, so we're doing very well. And part of that has been our investments in infrastructure. That has driven growth. It's driven job creation. So we want to be able to continue to do that. And you're going to get onto reciprocity, but just to say that we will do everything we have to stand up for Ontario businesses and workers in this province. And we know that NAFTA has benefited our economy. We know that without question. And theirs too. So we don't want to get into a trade war. That's not where we want to go. But in the conversations, if we have to draw a line, and I think, I think Chrystia Freeland and the Prime Minister they've said these are no-go. When we talk about auto, we talk about agriculture, there are non-negotiables, and we are going to be very clear about those, and we will not step over those lines. So whether it's the country of origin rules or whether it's the supply management, we have systems that work here, and we can look to what's going on in the States and find challenges there, but it's working, so let's not blow it up. And that's the message that I've taken to governors. And as I say, they agree. They don't see the point in blowing it up either.
Does their grassroots really understand? I've seen some surveys, one done of Western Ontario about 4 years ago, which I referred to in the book I wrote about U.S.-Canada slowly merging. Do they really the grassroots, it looked like the degree of understanding about the importance of Canada and or the relationship, the interdependency, disappears the further away from the border you get.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you had talked, the Oklahoma governor would be a case in point. Florida, of course, gets it because 5% of their economy is snowbirds.
Yeah. They know
5%.
Canadians. Yeah.
They love us. But what about some of the other states? Do they really? How did you find? Was there a difference between the border and the other guys?
Absolutely. I think it's more of a challenge, as you say. The border states really understand it, but I think once you move away, it becomes more of a challenge. And I think the other thing that's going on, Diane, is that trade has been put at the center of this argument about dislocation, right? Dislocation of workers, changing economy, and I think. There's been an attempt, and I would say during the American election in general, to blame trade for a lot of other change that's happening in the economy. And so, nobody in the context of NAFTA is talking about the dislocation because of technology. It's all about the trade relationship. And I think that until we can have a more comprehensive conversation about what's actually happening, what is changing in the economy that is affecting the lives of some of the people you're talking about in jurisdictions. Whether they're in the manufacturing sector and advanced manufacturing is dislocating them, or whether it's in coal mining and there are changes that are happening that mean that those jobs are not going to come back. I mean, those discussions have not happened, I think, at the grassroots level. And so it's harder for the leadership in those states to stand up and say that, NAFTA, I mean, they all said to me very diplomatically, we think that there are some changes to NAFTA that could help, but they were at the fringes as opposed to central changes. I think the other dynamic is that we've got a third partner here. So Mexico is part of the conversation. I think that we have up until now felt that really this was about consternation around the U.S.-Mexico relationship. But the deeper you get into NAFTA, the more you realize that it's a three-way supply chain. It's a three-way integrated system. And so it's harder to just say we're going to have a good relationship with Canada, not such a good relationship with Mexico. It doesn't work that way because, look at the guys from Windsor. the auto sector will tell you it's dependent on that supply chain that includes Mexico. So I would say there's a real need for public education of how integrated we are, which is that's been my personal mission, to get down there to try to talk to some of the media in the various states to make the case. It's like unscrambling an egg. Yeah. I think it may happen. I think 3 bilaterals might be the best option down the road. That may be where we end up. That's my own opinion. Where we end up. That's really interesting. So infrastructure, you're putting a lot of emphasis on. It has an immediate job creation effect and sort of to the community's benefits. What are the other benefits in terms of longer term economic development, and how are you shaping your policies and your commitments to projects in that respect? Well, so let me give you an example. So when I was first in this role, I went to Kitchener-Waterloo, and I was sitting down with a round table of young entrepreneurs in the tech sector at Communitech, and they were, we were going to have a conversation about innovation and startups and, I thought venture capital, all that stuff. They wanted to talk to me about trains, because they wanted to know that as a government we were thinking about the connectivity of the region. They wanted to know...
Hyperloop.
Yeah, well, yes, that's... okay. It's an option.
Apparently you can use a Hyperloop. You can repurpose empty oil pipelines into Hyperloop.
Create a vacuum and suck you into Kitchener-Waterloo, yeah. But they wanted to know that we were thinking about, the Toronto, Kitchener-Waterloo, London, Windsor corridor. They wanted to know that was, that we understood that was what they wanted and what people coming to Ontario were going to want. If they were going to work in this sector, they wanted to be able to get to all the different centres, but they wanted to be able to live outside of the GTA if they chose to. So I think there's a mid-term benefit and imperative to building infrastructure, which is we need to draw business to Ontario in the immediate and short term. We need to make sure that we continue to grow, and that the quality of life is what young people and businesses and employers want to see. So there's that piece, and then from my perspective, there's the longer term. We cannot afford, as a huge geography with a small population, to allow our roads and bridges, our schools and hospitals to degrade. We have lots of challenges, and this is happening all over the Western world and beyond, the urbanization. But if we want to preserve the ability for people to live in smaller communities, we have to pay attention to their infrastructure, and we cannot expect small municipalities to rely on their property tax base to build long-term infrastructure. It's impossible. And so we have a provincial responsibility to look at the regional economies and to understand that infrastructure is part of that. And in one region, it'll be about large culverts and bridges. You go to Kenora, there are 19 bridges in Kenora. Well, they've all got to be maintained. It could be about widening the Trans-Canada Highway, or it could be in our urban centres, making sure that we find a way to make sure that our hospitals and our schools are kept in good shape. Even though we've got lots of them and there's lots of capacity, our demographics are changing, so we have to build those institutions. So it looks different community by community, but it has to do with that long-term viability of communities.
And it's very difficult to sort of imagine. First of all, it's impossible to know the future 20 years out,
right,
because of the acceleration of acceleration.
Right.
But it's impossible to sort of build for the leapfrog. In other words, okay, we're going to have drones delivering everything, replacing all the trucks. We're going to have driverless cars that are electrically powered. So that really changes everything in terms of infrastructure built. So it's tricky for you. You've got to kind of know what may happen or what you want to push to happen, but you can't commit money until you know what is going to happen.
Well,
it's a catch-22. It's
laying a foundation, right? So the number one ask from small rural municipalities at this point is broadband. They want, and that is infrastructure, that's foundational infrastructure for the 21st century. And so I don't know all the technology, as you said. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But we do know that there's some fundamentals that have to be there today, and that's what we're trying to anticipate.
Get back to, I forgot to give you a supplemental on the Buy America stuff, the reciprocity issue. It's very upsetting to a lot of people, and it certainly has been something I've themed a lot. Whatever trade agreements we have, and the Europeans are just as protectionist as the Americans are.
Absolutely.
In fact, maybe worse. And we have free trade deals with them, but we have no guarantees that our people get a chance there. What, as the Premier, are you looking at in terms of if Governor Cuomo's government says, well, the heck with it, we're doing Buy America procurement, and you can like it or lump it. What do you do? You've talked a little bit about that, but I just wondered how you feel.
So I can give you the real life example of that because we were in New York. So when the Buy America provision was going through the New York legislature some months ago, we had people on the ground. Monique Smith was on the ground. There were, we had Ontario experts there talking to all of the legislators, walking the halls, talking to them. And the Buy America provision that they were looking at was much broader than what actually went through. And in the first instance, it got killed altogether, and then they brought back a much narrower one. But
what does narrow mean?
Well, it just means it wasn't across the whole economy. It was some small.
So
it was on procurement.
Pencils, but I can't sell a road, or how to?
Yeah, it was it was more that it was on procurement as opposed to trade of all goods and services, right?
Okay.
So, but what we did to actually have that sort of modicum of success was we said, if you're going to bring in this broad provision of Buy America, then we're going to reciprocate. We're drafting legislation that would say, we can't bid on your stuff, you can't bid on ours. And that was one of the ways we actually moved to a much narrower provision. But we're right now having to watch across the country to see where other Buy America provisions might pop up. It's very labor intensive, and it's part of this very uncertain time that we've entered into. I'm spending a disproportionate amount of my time worrying about and thinking about how to interact with our American partners that certainly 2 or 3 years ago we never would have envisioned.
Because the degree of integration as a result of going back to the FTA.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's amazing.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Okay, another question I wanted to ask you about. You just hosted Bernie Sanders.
I did.
For a healthcare tour. And I have a conflict of interest. I love Bernie. I wrote his name in on my ballot in Chicago and spoiled it. He's fantastic. And one of the things he's done is, of course, he has been espousing the Canadian playbook for just about every policy. So tell me his reaction and the kind of questions he asked. And that must have been amazing.
It was great. We spent pretty much a day and a bit together. And he met with a whole lot of healthcare practitioners. He was really here to talk about healthcare. He was here to explode some myths for the American media about the Canadian healthcare system. So we visited Mount Sinai NICU and saw what was happening with the tiny babies. We visited UHN at Toronto General and saw the cardiac center there. We went to Women's College. So he had an opportunity to see 3 great hospitals and talk to health practitioners. But it was so interesting because I was very proud of the healthcare system, and we talked about what more we needed to do, and I talked about our OHIP Plus plan to provide free medication for kids from birth to 25. But we talked beyond that about what a fair society looks like, and how government can actually support people and allow them to take part in the economy. And so, we talked about job creation, we talked about post-secondary education. I told them about the free tuition that we've put in place for kids from low and low income families, and he was all excited. He said, they can do it in Canada, we can do it in the States. He was very enthusiastic. He's a man on a mission. But it was really interesting to me the degree to which we didn't stay just on healthcare. It was much more about what's government's role and what's the capacity of government to actually create a more level playing field. And if you believe that people come in with different advantages and that it's actually we don't have a fair society, then how do we move towards that? Yeah. How do we move towards that? And I think in the context of infrastructure, one of the things I grapple with all the time as the Premier is not every region is created equally, and at a particular point in history, one region may be burgeoning and another region may not be. So how can government even that out, you know? And yes, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area eats up a lot of our energy and our infrastructure investment, but we're doing equal. If you look across the province, we're doing equal investment across the province. So that fairness theme with Bernie was huge, you know. It's what he believes in. It's what he stands for.
Totally.
And he was happy to be here to see what we were doing, which was a great. Yeah, it was a great thing.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. He may win. You never know. I hope he runs again. Okay, here's some questions from the audience.
That was the American.
That's the American
chiming in.
side of Diane, not the Canadian side. What more can you tell us concerning high-speed rail in Ontario?
High-speed rail in Ontario. So this is not the Hyperloop, but we've made a commitment to high-speed rail from Toronto through to Windsor. The environmental assessment is underway. We've just put a planning advisory board in place. So we are moving to put the building blocks in place there. And that doesn't take the place of the regional express rail, because we are also building full-time two-way GO service between Toronto and Kitchener-Waterloo. But that will be a very different service. That will be lots of stops. And what we're looking for is under an hour from Toronto to Kitchener-Waterloo, and just over that to get to London. So it's a pretty exciting project. And we've been talking about high-speed rail in this province for 35 years. When I became the Minister of Transportation in 2010, I discovered that there are gnomes in the basement, engineer gnomes in the basement who have been working on this for years. So it's not that we don't have the capacity and the engineering ability, we just haven't gotten on it. So we're moving it forward.
Ambassador Bridge.
Ambassador Bridge, yes.
How concerned
we built the road, for the love of God. We built the road.
I know. How concerned is Ontario about the procurement of the crossing in the light of the Ambassador Bridge issue, and how will it impact the current P3 procurement?
Well, it is the federal government that is on the bridge project. We've got good people who are involved in that. We want to see it go ahead. Rick Snyder, the governor of Michigan, and I have been on this. He was the governor when I was Minister of Transportation. We've been talking about this since then, and we want to see this happen. It's very complicated, as you know. There are complicated personalities and lots of history around this, but I am confident, given what we know about, we talked about integration, but when you live in Windsor or you live in Detroit, you live integrated economies. I mean, you have friends who travel across the bridge to work or go through the tunnel to work. So, I was in Windsor and Detroit for the Great Lakes Governors, and the tunnel was closed, and so there's one way across the river. So I'm confident it's going to get built, Diane. Can I tell you exactly the time frame? No, but we are. Kind of
interesting little historical anecdote, and I don't think it's much different now, but the St. Lawrence Seaway, which to everybody's observation has been a smash hit for both countries. Canada tried to mount that for decades, and it wasn't until a general, Eisenhower, was the president of the United States, and he said, wait a minute, we got to build this because it's a security problem.
Right.
And it got built.
Right. Yeah.
So, you always have a different, you have to get into their heads and understand what's going to help.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that there isn't that sort of public demand, but I think it will come.
Good. Why was Toronto's proposal for toll roads turned down so quickly? My eyes are not great. Was turned down so quickly given the experience with hot lanes on highways?
The issue around the toll lanes on the highways or on the two roads in Toronto was really about the need for a regional plan. And John Tory and I had talked about revenue tools. We had talked about tolling. He knew that philosophically I'm not opposed to tolling. The hot lanes are evidence of that. But what happened was there was no regional discussion. There was no heads up for the other mayors, the other jurisdictions outside of the City of Toronto proper, and there aren't enough options. People don't have choices, and so until they have those choices, I think we have to be careful how we force this kind of revenue tool. So that was the politics of it, and he understands that. We've increased the gas tax. We've doubled the gas tax, so he's able to, they were able to be made whole on that. But I understand, and he and I have talked about this, I understand it's not the same thing as having a revenue stream against which you can borrow in the same way. So we're still working on that. It was just that the folks from Peel and the folks from Durham and York didn't feel that they had been part of the discussion. And I think there has to be a regional plan around that kind of revenue.
That's very sensible.
Yeah.
How can Ontario assist the feds in terms of high-risk water systems? In terms of financing or
the water and
otherwise?
wastewater?
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting question because we've just been working with the feds on their infrastructure investments and the water and wastewater systems. There have been water and wastewater systems around the province that have been upgraded, that are being upgraded because of that partnership between the municipal, the federal, and the provincial. And I think that we can do more of that. I think there's one area that we've fallen woefully behind, and that is water systems and First Nation communities. And this is a bedeviling problem. I will just say, and I don't know whether Jane Philpott talked about it when she was here. We've had a situation where the province has had the expertise and the science and the capacity to do a lot of the work in First Nation communities. The feds are the funder. And what we've been trying to drive from the provincial level is an integration of those things so that there would be a one-stop for First Nations communities. Because what happens is often and I've been to a number of fly-in communities, and what happens is there'll be a new water treatment plant that's built, and then there isn't a troubleshooting that goes on. So if it breaks down, there isn't anybody who can fix it, or it takes a long time for it to get fixed, and then the situation gets worse. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do is bring together that provincial expertise, the federal funding, and then the training for First Nations communities themselves so that they actually have the capacity to deal with their own water systems. So that's an area where we're probably doing worse than when we look at the work that's happening in municipalities. But at least all three levels of government, orders of government, are aware of it now.
It's just very thorny.
It is, and I've got from time to time I see the list of boil water orders on First Nations communities, and it shifts around. Sometimes it's one list, and then it's another list. They get fixed, they break down again, and we don't have the sustainable solution yet, and that's the bedeviling part of it.
And then there's a land claims issue. Mining is very important. It sort of built this country and
Mm-hmm.
still sustains it to a great extent. I was involved in it. Ring of Fire, I mean, that fell apart. Is that ever possibly going to be resurrected?
Well, it actually hasn't fallen apart.
No?
No, we've got companies that have claims that are very pleased that we now have two communities that in the sort of northwestern part of the Ring of Fire area where we're moving ahead to build a road. Because the companies are looking for a road into the Ring of Fire, and so Webequie and Nibinamik are working with us to get that infrastructure built. We've had $1 billion on the table, and that $1 billion we will start to use to build that road. A road.
A freight train too.
We're working on the
later.
road infrastructure because that's really been the missing link. And then Martin Falls is the third community that we have an agreement with to start. Because what you've got is 9 First Nations communities in the what's called the Matawa First Nations, and they are the group.
Claims.
And overlapping
They're
claims.
Fighting.
They're not all on the same page. We tried to get a consensus on what the road would be and how the community roads would connect with the main road. We couldn't get that consensus. We worked at it for literally 2 years. And so what we've got now is some agreements with individual communities. But my expectation and hope is that as we start to see some progress on those roads that we've got agreements on, then the other communities will tie into the roads.
Then you can do electrification and maybe freight train and that sort of infrastructure.
And what the companies were looking for was an indication that we were moving ahead with building the infrastructure. They've seen that now. They're happy with that. And so we'll see some progress there. I mean, the reality is the commodity prices have been low, and that was part of the challenge a few years ago. But the infrastructure piece has to go ahead because, yes, it's important for the Ring of Fire, but it's important for those communities, for their economic development and their economic well-being, especially when you look at what climate change is doing to the winter roads. You know, the winter roads aren't lasting as long now, and so you actually need to build permanent roads because the ice roads don't stay in as long. And if you think about a fly-in community like Webequie, there are probably 600 or so people living there. And if they want to get a house repaired, they've got to fly in.
Oh, Lord.
And you can't, you know, you need those winter roads to actually ship stuff in.
So that's actually
materials.
happening? What are we talking, knocking a month off the cold weather per year?
So you think about getting equipment up to those communities. That shortens your shipment
exploration,
season.
drilling, everything.
Yeah. So that's why the all-weather roads are so important. So it's about Ring of Fire, but it's about the long-term well-being of those communities.
What about the tech infrastructure that you see to help sustain the tech industry or communities that are now starting to burgeon around the province here and there? What capacity building infrastructure, maybe not physical infrastructure, but other kinds of infrastructure are you looking at?
It's interesting because I talked about the train. I talked about that connectivity that businesses are looking for. They're also looking for communities that are that provide amenities. And the whole discussion around social infrastructure, the federal government has allocated some resources for social infrastructure because as communities, young people move in or want to go home, want to go back to their communities, they want to have a quality of life that's comparable to the quality of life they would have in a bigger center. So that's something that I hear from municipalities a lot. And so I think we've still got some work to do with our federal partners on how do we actually provide for that, because there's a lot of aging infrastructure around this province. And if I think about arenas and community centers, not just roads and bridges, although that's part of it, a lot of that was 70s build, 60s and 70s. And I was alive in the 60s and 70s, and I'm creaking, so it's creaking too.
No, you're not. Educational technology, what are you doing in the educational sector to build capacity?
Yeah, so as new schools are built or schools are retrofitted, making sure that kids have access to the technology that they're going to work with in their jobs. That's one piece of it. But I also think that part of the solution to making sure kids have access to technology is not just about building it into the schools. It's about partnering the education system with the private sector, because we can't, as a public system, we can't keep up with what the private sector can do. And so, partnering with tech companies, partnering with whether it's health tech or whether it's clean tech, giving kids the opportunity to see what's happening in the private sector is going to get them. It's going to take them a long way. And so we're really putting a focus on work experience and experiential learning, hands-on learning, helping kids to get out. Math, yes, math, STEM, STEM in general. And the whole discussion around girls and STEM, it comes up every time we talk about technology. The tech sector, it's been a pretty male environment, and we need to make sure that the whole population is involved. And so we're partnering with companies like Google to make sure that we do what we can to broaden the scope of the kids who are seeing that as a choice.
Just to return back, how will the question from the arts, how will Ontario engage with Indigenous populations in regard to P3s?
I think those conversations are starting, and I don't actually. I think on some of the energy projects, we're working hard to make sure that whether it's First Nation or Métis, that there are opportunities for partnership, and that's government and private sector partnership. Economic development is a real focus of our regional Indigenous leaders in Ontario, and so whether it's access to capital, and that is a big challenge for small communities, and I don't think we've actually cracked that nut, but it will only get dealt with if we have the federal government, the private sector, and the provinces and the First Nations communities working together, and the Métis Nation.
This is a cheeky question, and I didn't do it. It's not my fault.
She's reading it.
What would you build with the money spent on Bombardier? Honestly, I didn't get it. Good question, though. You can
I think I'm going to pass on that one.
Okay, how can the...
I'll just, let me just, I never like to say no comment. Bombardier is an important Canadian company. It's a very important Canadian company, and we want to continue to work. I mean, we have a different relationship to Bombardier than the government of Quebec does, and then the federal government does. But we want to see them to succeed. We want to see them succeed, but we also need to protect the interests of the projects here in Ontario and make sure that we have the best rolling stock and the best on-time delivery of those materials.
This is an interesting question, a structural one. Have you thought about blending the efforts of Infrastructure Ontario and Metrolinx?
Well, they work very closely together. Infrastructure Ontario is bigger than Metrolinx. Metrolinx is the Regional Transit Authority, but Infrastructure Ontario works on projects all over the province that some have to do with transit and some don't. So I think that as it stands now, I think Infrastructure Ontario is it's a real, as I said, I think it's a model, and I think we need to support it and build it. We're wondering what's going to happen with the infrastructure bank. We want to make sure that that there isn't overlap there, that there isn't duplication, and that Infrastructure Ontario, as it has grown, it continues to be as clear and as powerful as it is. And I think the Metrolinx piece, I think them working in partnership with Infrastructure Ontario is the way it should stay. I think blending, I think it could be complicated, and I think that it could move the focus of Infrastructure Ontario in a way that wouldn't necessarily be helpful.
So you think there's benefits in both of them?
I think there's benefits in both. I do.
Okay.
Well, and as I say, Metrolinx works closely with Infrastructure Ontario, and their expertise is it goes back and forth. So I think we can find ways to make sure that they continue to work closely together without collapsing the two organizations.
Great. That's a wrap. She's terrific, eh?
Thank you, everybody. Was that an hour? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well done.
Mark.
I mean, really terrific. Thank you very much for that. It's always a pleasure, Premier, to have you on our podium. Every year we think that we'll be asking the same questions, and every year it's new and different and insightful. And it helps to have a journalist right next to you there who asks just the right questions.
Yeah.
So I think you proved to be a dynamic duo today for sure. But as I say, you're special to the council, and so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, of course, and also to let you know that we'll make a donation to Habitat for Humanity on your behalf.
Thank you very much.
So please join me again in thanking Premier Wynne and Diane.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Diane.
I'd also like, it's fitting, I think, at the moment to take this opportunity to recognize the Women's Infrastructure Network. And as you may know, they held their annual breakfast this morning, and many of the members of the Wynne Group are actually attending the conference. We're a big supporter of Wynne's dedication to fostering networking and development of women in the infrastructure field. And the reality is that they have over 1,000 members now across Canada. So they are a force, and you saw it play itself out here just a couple of minutes ago. We'll be hearing from them at lunch tomorrow as we put the spotlight on their Leadership Award program, which is now in its third year. And the University of Toronto professor Matti Simiotiki will be discussing the issue of diversity and gender balance in the We Can Do Better session after lunch. I'd like to also take this opportunity to remind you about the Council's Resource Centre. We've recently published a process guide for public sponsors, as well as our wide array of case studies and surveys and other guidance materials, all available outside in the resource area. So I'd now ask you to make your way directly to the Grand Ballroom where we were this morning, because the next item up on the agenda is today's luncheon. We'll be recognizing and celebrating our 2017 award recipients and hearing from a very, very interesting keynote speaker, Salim Ismail, about the amazing future of technology and the implications for infrastructure. I also hope you took our homework assignment seriously and watched his video as a prelude to his speech at lunch today. So we head from here off to the Grand Ballroom. See you there. Thank you very much.